welcome everybody to our webinar on process improvement. My name is Travis Cheney. I'm the CEO and a transformation guide here with Dynamic Directions. We also have Mike Brink, who's our operations specialist, who will be joining us with some commentary. Mike, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well wherever you are.
Yes, and I'm in our hub and home office in Owensboro, Kentucky. Michael, where are you today?
I am in Westchester, Pennsylvania.
Perfect. Well, we're going to bring it together here between Kentucky and Pennsylvania, and we're going to talk about process improvement. Because what we know is without process improvement, things will fall through the cracks, especially for those of you who are in the growth mode. Because one of the things that we've noticed over time is as financial planning practices grow, that typically means a need for stronger infrastructure because you're adding more people. Whether that's more people in lieu of clients and team members, you're growing. We need to identify what these processes are and give yourself the best shot of producing a predictable experience both internally with your team, but more importantly with your clients. So if you're in growth mode, the volume of the processes will only increase across the board, and you're going to create some capacity issues. And your fear of tasks and services falling through the cracks will become a reality if your financial planning practice doesn't employ efficient and productive systems. So let's dive right in. What is a process? It's a series of steps or related tasks, has a defined start and end, includes actions and yes and no decisions. You can make this at a very high level, very conceptual, or in many cases you want to get as detailed as possible with many steps. Really, it's all about coming up with some result in lieu of an output for one type of service or product you're trying to deliver. So now that we've got that defined, let's talk about, Michael, what are these 5 H's and why is it important we understand these 5 H's?
It's important that we understand these 5 H's because these are going to be the items that we look at when we decide what processes we want to improve first. So any organization has a number of processes, and you don't have time to focus on all of them at the same time. So we can use these 5 H's to determine which process we want to focus on to begin with. So we want to look at processes that have high volume, high cost, high risk, high impact, high variation on the practice. And typically the first processes that you want to maybe work on are ones that have 2 or 3 of these H's involved in the process.
So by labeling them, you're basically giving your sense of priority on probably what needs to be worked on first as far as your process improvement. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So it's the first step when you sit down and you want to determine what do I want to work on. These 5 H's can help you answer that question.
And what are some examples of these 5 H's that you've found in working with financial planning practices?
For high volume, most practices have a number of managed accounts, for example. So your managed account process is going to be a high volume process because of the number of managed accounts that you have. Financial planning has a lot of cost to the practice. It's a lot of times people are outsourcing part of the financial planning, so there's a high cost to running that process. A high risk process could be a process that has a compliant risk or a risk to losing clients to performing poorly. So that could be documentation, documenting your work, all the rules that we have regarding compliance, and failing to follow those processes correctly cause high risk to the practice. High impact processes, I generally look at the ones that are client facing in my mind. So your client prep process, I look at client preparation, those meetings, you're meeting with your client is your opportunity to shine, demonstrate to the client that you're working there for them. That's where you're going to be asking for referrals. So that process is a very high impact process.
wins. So it's important that we identify within those processes where they land to help label them. And then let's talk about a quick exercise that we find is important. This is in the workbook that accompanies the webinar, the process improvement workbook. And what we want you to do is list all the processes that are going on in your office. And Mike, you remember we did this, I guess, a month or so back with a group of advisors, and we came up with, what was it, about at least 30 different processes that are going on in a practice?
Yes, it was 30 or so processes that we came up with, and I don't think we were, don't think we got them all, so yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So the purpose is to go ahead and list all of these and then go back and label them with those different H's, the 5 H's, so that you can see, based on what you've got going in volume, cost, impact, and so forth, which processes you would want to work on first. Because what we've found is a lot of practices do have some checklists and processes, but what we're taking you through today is going to be very thorough. We're establishing universal language to use and some steps to make sure that all the processes that you're going to have in your practice are taking a very formalized approach. So, a flow diagram. Michael and I were joking a little bit about this in preparation today because I think over time Mike may have not been a big fan of the flow charts here, but he obviously sees the need to put together a visual display, because that's what we're using here with a flow chart or a flow diagram as it's called, is we're actually, especially if you've got a very lengthy process, it's good to map out the steps with these different symbols here that keeps everything moving so that you've got some visual to work with that you can then come back and layer in some additional steps that would go into play. So, for example, we just said, hey, here's a simple flow chart for driving to work. You can see what we've used here as far as, getting up, the alarm clock goes off, hit snooze button, you got yes and no's. You're going through the various steps. There probably could have been a lot more steps, but this is there again at a high level. Mike, anything to add on the use of these flow diagrams?
No, I mean, a lot of times when you have these complete, and especially when a team's looking at them together, just looking at the diagram can help drive some decisions on improvements. When you see it like that, it really becomes clear to people sometimes. They're no longer inside the process, they're working outside and looking at a picture of it, so it can be very helpful.
Very good. Yeah, and you just stated some of the benefits there. Anytime I think we can go through an exercise and we begin documenting items like this, I believe when it comes through your head down to the pen, so to speak, you're going to get some more clarity around it. And like you said, the visual display of it, you're thinking outside of it instead of being in it. And then plus, not everybody we come across in a process knows what the other steps are involved. They might just know their step in a process. So it's very good for all the team members to look at this flow diagram to see where they fit in, but more importantly, where everybody else fits in. So, another exercise in the workbook, now that you've identified everything, you're going to then decide on your priorities, and then you'll also see in the workbook, those symbols that we just used in the flow diagram, that you can begin charting out at least 1 or 2 processes here. So let's talk about measurement. Well, measurement is very important. This is where we see a lot of practices have a shortfall in any process. They may have the steps outlined. They may have who's going to do the steps, but they really don't have a lot of these measurements, do they, Mike?
No, in fact, this tends to be where things start to go awry, is just not knowing, not measuring how well you're producing or how well the process is working for you. And that makes it impossible to even work on fixing them because you don't have an idea of how to measure the improvement in the end.
So let's talk about a couple of these. So outcomes. What we're really looking at is, for each process, we're looking at what is the for the process itself, what is the outcome? What is how do we define success? And then we start looking at the key process steps, and a couple components of that is we're looking at what is the step, who owns the step, but Mike, talk about these measurements like speed, productivity, and quality, and how that comes into play along with the desired output for each step.
Yeah, well, first of all, speed is always a big one. Speed translates to cost. So you want to know how long it's taking to do something to get to the quality that you want. And it's important to be measuring that. You can make a lot of decisions are made based on speed. Am I taking too long? Is the outcome not worth the time and effort that's going into that? So speed's an important measure. Productivity and how much you can produce of each outcome. And we were talking about growth before. This is really when you're looking at your ability to grow as a practice, understanding the productivity and how much you can produce of something. It's one thing to decide that you're going to do 200 more financial plans, but what's that going to cost? Can you produce 200 more financial plans? Is that going to require more staffing? Are you going to change the way you do financial plans? What is your current team's productivity in producing plans? And then quality, defining, how you want something to look and the quality control of that. And especially with client-facing items such as a financial plan, what's your expectation? What's that going to look like to the clients? You don't want misspellings. You don't want incorrect data. You don't want pages that carry on to the last page, just the quality of your work and what you want the standard that you want to represent from your practice, what your practice is going to look like. So those are key measures in any process that you want to be, having a process produce something at the standard and quality that you represent for your practice.
Yeah, a few things come to mind, Mike, for me. Is one, when you're building a process, and we'll use financial plan deliverables as an example. If you're doing 100 financial plan deliverables, yet your goal is to get to 300 over a certain period of time, let's say over the next 18 months, the process should be built not for where you are currently. The process should be built on where we're going with this. So that's a common flaw. I see people build processes based on current capacity versus the capacity they want in growth. The other thing I thought about when you were talking about speed and quality, where we see people getting tripped up a lot is when they're on the path to perfection as opposed to being on the path of functionality. And to bring that to life, simply put, financial plan deliverables, I see an enormous amount of detail put into these deliverables, and when you peel back the onion, what we find out it's either the advisor or the team that's putting them together is really building the plan for them and not the client. And so what happens is this striving for perfection trumps functionality. And so I think we have to be very careful here when we're thinking about speed. One, build it for something that is going to be bigger than what we have now capacity-wise, but also in looking at when you're building things, are you building it for you or are you building for the client? When you look through the client's eyes, the majority of clients, especially on a deliverable, they would just want your advice. That's really what they've hired us for. So any thoughts on what I just said?
Yeah, well, process improvement is a lot about choices. So, you just hit on the head. A financial plan is a good example. So you can produce a financial plan in 8 hours that has a certain standard that you defined. The question is that the most productive use of those 8 hours? And by knowing that it's going to take 8 hours to meet a certain standard and understanding, that and the cost of that allows you to make a decision, like you just said, well, is this really worth that effort? Am I doing this for my client? Am I doing this for myself? What would it look like if I produce a financial plan in 2 hours and it still meet the client's expectation? And then obviously you can produce 4 times as many financial plans using that process. So there's a lot of give and take when you're looking at process improvement, making those decisions and understanding where you are within the process.
great point. Great point. Let's talk about where this goes awry. Of course, I love this. If you don't measure, how will you know if the process is improving? It makes me think of a quote I use probably daily, which is, you got to manage what you measure and you got to measure what you manage. Otherwise, we don't know where we stand with things. So let's talk now about how leaders, so this would be the owners of our financial planning practice, usually the practitioners that, the financial advisors here. How have you seen this come into play? How do they mess this stuff up?
One of the biggest things I've seen with the practices that I'm working with is just confusion within the practice. The people producing whatever the outcome are, the participants in the process, not quite understanding what they're shooting for in the end. What's the goal? What's the output going to look like? And not having a clear definition of what they're striving for. So maybe there's 2 or 3 people working on the same process, but different ideas of what they're trying to achieve. So to me, that's kind of a lack of clarity, and it's a little different from just a lack of clarity of what the outcome should look like. So the next thing was...
So let me just stop you there. So it's really important, whoever's leading this, right, that they've got to be very clear about what they want in this process. Otherwise, they're sending them out somewhat blindly. Am I hearing you correctly?
Exactly. And then your team can be working in opposite directions, or not. There could be tension within the process itself because 2 different people are looking to achieve different goals within the process. So a clear understanding of what the outcome needs to look like is essential before you can even start designing or working on improving the process.
Okay. Jumping to quick solutions.
We're all busy, and you just want a solution. The manager of the process wants it just fixed, and you want a fast solution. You don't want to spend time trying to understand what's going wrong. And sometimes some processes are pretty complicated. It takes a little bit of work. It might require maybe like a time and motion study, for example, to see what's going wrong. Where are we taking extra time, and those aren't quick solutions. It might be a week or 2 that you have to do some research, and not wanting to devote the time to that.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't just throw Band-Aids at this when we're looking at this. We need to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, you want to understand what's going wrong. And it could be a number of things. Sometimes you have an idea of what's going wrong. You jump to conclusion without actually investigating it, and the conclusion really isn't the solution. And like you said, you throw a Band-Aid down and you try to fix the quickest, come up with the easiest solution, and it doesn't fix the problem in the end.
Well, and I like what we're helping people build here, because if you execute on this properly and something goes wrong, we should be able to go step by step. Hey, step 1, yep, that was taken care of. Step 2, yep, that looks good. Step 3 is good. 4 is good. Oh, 5, here's the problem, right? So if we have this laid out, and then we can look at, where was it, the speed issue? Was it the quality issue, productivity? If it comes down to who owns that, was it a will issue? In other words, did they just not do it? Did they just skip it? Or did they, make a judgment call and do something different? Or maybe it's a skill issue. Maybe they just don't know how to do it. But that's where I think the beauty of having this process well documented is once something goes awry, we go right back to the process, follow the steps, and we should be able to find out, what went wrong.
Yep, exactly. With a little effort, you can generally figure out what's going wrong.
Sure. So are you saying leaders don't listen to their team in process improvement?
Yeah, we see that. I mean, the people that understand the best how to fix a process typically are the people actually within the process. They know which things are taking them a little extra time. They know where some of the barriers are in the process, and listening to your team and maybe understanding the need to remove a barrier or to do something a little differently to get greater impact from the process. And like I said, they're the ones implementing, so they're generally the best to understand that. I think you look back when I was in college, Japanese manufacturers were starting to overtake American manufacturers manufacturers, and that was the big thing the Japanese had learned by listening to the people on the assembly line. They were able to have a much better process in building cars than the American teams were.
Yeah, I think some of the best practices I've seen is leaders where they basically get clear, like you said in the beginning, they got to get clear. Here's what we want it to look like. Here's some guidelines to follow. Turn the people loose, like you said, who are within the process. They come back and say, okay, based on the parameters, your objective and how you define success and these guidelines, here's how we think we should work this system or fix the system. That's basically what you're recommending, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, and I think it's hard sometimes for the financial advisors or the owners of the firm to essentially say, well, I'm going to do what my employees tell me to do, but really that's what we advocate and think works best in situations with these processes. Would you agree?
Yes, and once you decide the end, why be concerned about exactly how they're getting there? If they're giving you the end product that you desire, that you're looking for, let your team work that out. Your team has the most vested interest to be doing that the most efficient way possible, and your goal is the outcome. So I highly recommend focusing on the outcome, let the team figure out how to get you there.
Okay. What about this fourth bullet point, not measure before and after making changes?
Yeah, so basically, and this was just simple, it's pretty self-explanatory. You sit down, you want to improve a process, but if you don't measure before the process, it's difficult to tell. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to tell whether you've improved the process at all. So you clearly want to have an idea of where you stand before you start and be able to measure later on to see that you're making progress and the process is actually improving. And that requires measuring before and measuring ongoing and measuring at the end.
I'm seeing some themes here, Mike. The word measure has been on almost every slide we put together here. So I hear you. Talk about under-resourcing the effort. How do leaders mess up that part?
Yeah, it just gets back a little bit back to the jump into quick solutions here. It's just, just wanting it fixed and not spending the time or, the resources inside the practice to implement these steps. The process, there's a process kind of to fix the process, I like to say. And not implementing the process, not going through this workbook, not taking the step-by-step process to undertake this process improvement and just wanting it to be done. So not putting the resources, not your time, your team's time, and the other resources necessary to create the improvement.
Yeah, that also includes money. If we need upgrades with technology or specific pieces of equipment, hire maybe a consultant to help and get you there faster. I mean, it's money has to be included with this time element as well. Well, let's talk a little more, Mike. Put you on the interview here spot. So we've gone through an outline through the workbook. Everyone has that workbook as a result of this webinar. We've defined what a process is. We've put together a process for you for each process that you're trying to flush out here, as far as the key steps, how to measure it, and so forth. What are some other things? So let's say that people get this up and running, they got it. What are some other ways that once they have a process in place that you see these processes start to underperform? What's some other rationale or reasoning?
Sometimes, the process to create it, and it's flawed for a reason or not. So in the end, you have a poorly designed process. And that's generally usually the easiest thing to fix. That's where the flow chart can come in handy. But the process itself just isn't designed to produce the output consistently that you were looking to have produced. Another area, sometimes there's more than one person involved in the process, or a number of people are using the same process. Maybe you have more than one person producing your meeting prep or financial plans, and not having an owner or someone that can oversee that process. So there really needs to be an owner, someone that's making sure that each step of the process process is being completed has the authority to, oversee that and to take corrective action when that's not happening.
Yeah, I think we've stumbled across that recently, where we had 3 people involved in the financial planning deliverables, and they all thought they were doing it similarly, but they weren't. And then when it came down to making one unified choice, there was no one in charge. And so, the first step that franchise owner and financial advisor took was they put someone in charge, so that way the buck stops there, as far as defining, what the process is going to look like and making sure the quality and speed and productivity were happening. So, very good point.
Another area, you can have a great process if the individuals functioning within the process are poorly trained, poorly motivated, not skilled to carry out their job duties. So a lot of times, we have a process this will work, but you haven't actually trained the operator to carry out their step in the process. So a process can't overcome poor training and poor staffing. People need to be up to speed on what they're doing and still do their jobs well to function within the process.
Which goes back to what you said. We got to have someone who owns that process that can help identify when those issues are arising and get people the training and the development they need.
Yeah. So another area you see is just not aligning the technology. So when the company's changing technology, maybe they've come out with a new report, and the report's better and includes more information than the prior 3 reports they had. Your process has, print this report, use that report, use report A, use report B, use report C. Meanwhile, they've come up with report D that, contains all 3 of those reports. But out of habit, because you haven't adjusted your process, you're still, producing the other 3 reports. So there's where your process is just not going to be as strong as it needs to be because you haven't kept up with the technology.
So it sounds like you need to have someone designated, there again, maybe for each process, to be on the lookout for what are the upgrades, what is new, and see how we can test that new information, reports, software, whatever it is, how this might even produce a more efficient, or it could be just a quality enhancement. Is that where you're saying we need to have someone looking out for those things and looking for ways to integrate it?
Exactly. So when advancements come down the road, you want to say, well, how can this be beneficial to us? How can I use this? And keep an open mind with that. You might put in months to develop a process and have it up and running, and you're happy with it and it's working well. So the mindset can become, well, we don't want to touch that. We spend a lot of time. We really like the result. It's doing great. But keeping an open mind and saying, well, maybe this new technology or maybe this new idea can improve what we're doing. So you always want to be revisiting and looking to make sure that you're keeping up with the times, that you're updating your processes to new technology. Maybe sometimes just even a new idea on how to do something. So.
Okay. Anything else? Any other things that you see?
No, failure, we've talked about measurements a number of times. Another area where I've seen a problem is when you potentially, a manager will put measurements for an employee a team member that doesn't align with the process. You have them focusing on something else for a bonus, for example, that isn't aligned with the results that you want from a certain process. So you want to make sure that you're aligning all this. If you have a process and you have certain measurements, but those are the same measurements that you're using to measure the performance of the people implementing a process. And that sounds simple and like it makes sense, but a lot of times you'll see that that's just not the case. For some reason, you've kind of gotten out of a line there. So you're giving someone a bonus for doing a certain amount of work over here that's actually not part of the measurement of a lot of the processes that they're working on.
So you're tying that to the HR function that goes along with the process, is making sure that whatever steps they're executing on, that ties into their professional development, their performance goals, bonuses. That's what you're saying, I believe.
Exactly. So again, if you have someone producing financial plans and you have a process and you have certain measurements and their goal is produced, on one hand, you're talking about, well, we like this process to produce 300 financial plans a year. But then when you sit down with them and you become disaligned and HR sits with them, and maybe the HR person somehow gives them bonus goals that don't relate to that. They just have goals that aren't aligned with the process that they're working on. So you have to be careful that that's not happening.
Okay, those are great insights. A couple things came to mind as you were giving that. One, I thought of the word territorial, and I've seen that happen. I think you've seen that happen, Mike, as well. Even when you get things defined, and you were talking about looking for new technology or ways to enhance. We've seen a lot of people, especially if they've been a part of creating that process, they can get an emotional attachment to it. Meaning that, wow, they can't see anything better or different because, geez, I brought this to the table. So I think that's one other thing that I would throw out there, that once you get going on this, you want people to take pride in their work, but we also don't want that pride to get in the way when we find new things. The other note I meant that I wrote down here as you were talking, and this gets back to measuring, but drift is a word that I'm using here, is that, and we haven't really talked about that, and I know measuring should help, but what we're really talking about is when you get these processes and systems in place, we're trying to make something very predictable, and when we notice something's going wrong, it's drifted away, and so I think that's the other thing to be aware of for those, especially who are measuring, is what we're really asking you to say or do here is make sure that we're sticking to the process, but you're looking for where things go awry, or I'll use the word drift. So, Michael, anything else in closing today around process improvement? Any encouragement to maybe the operations managers of the world, or these franchise owners or financial advisors out there going after process improvement?
No, other than it's worth the effort. What you can accomplish when you have a team that understands how this works. That's, what I've seen happen is, a lot of times it takes a lot of effort to do the first one and less effort to do the second one. And then, a team by nature, once they've learned how to do some of this, they start improving small processes. We talk about having 30 processes in your practice. You embark on this to improve 3 of them, but eventually the team learns to improve all 30 of them, and they learn to think efficiency all the time, and the overall improvement in the quality of what you're producing as a practice gets better. The amount that you're producing, the empowerment of your team. So there's a lot of positive items that come out of embarking on improving your processes at a company.
Do you know how to help people with their process improvement, Mike?
I do. I've been doing it pretty much most of my life, so I do.
Okay.
We were talking about flow charting before, and I think one of the reasons why I don't like flow charts is because I've probably done a couple thousand of them in my lifetime. So.
You have nightmares sometimes about flow charts. Is that what you're saying, Mike? Well, I only mention that. Those of you listening, I don't know what your relationship is with Dynamic Directions, but one of the reasons why we have Mike on our team is to help in areas of process improvement. So if that's something you're interested in, contact your coach, and we can determine, how and if Mike get involved and what that might look like. I just want to make sure everybody knew, Mike, that who you are, and this is something you've done all your life. You have a lot of experience outside the industry, but more importantly, in the last several years right here in our industry. So thank you, Mike. Well, that concludes our presentation today on process improvement. I want to thank you for investing your time and energy and effort in our webinar today. And I encourage you to go out, complete the workbook, take the advice that Mike has given you today, and follow the guidelines in that workbook to help you manage the infrastructure and growth with your people as you continue to increase the capacity with your growth goals. So with that said, this is Travis Cheney signing off for Mike Brink here at Dynamic Directions. Be bullish on life and win big.